Are European nations becoming Orwellian security states? That's the charge in an Amnesty International report. So have new anti-terror laws gone too far? Are they securing freedoms or freeing security agencies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. From declaring states of emergency to mass surveillance to so-called administrative measures, critics say basic human rights are being eroded across the continent, perhaps permanently. Amnesty International studied the situation in 14 countries over 2 years and concluded the European governments are increasingly restricting freedoms in disproportionate and discriminatory fashion. In France, for example, the country has passed new surveillance laws after the Charlie Hebdo newspaper office shooting in January 2015. Following the Bataclan theatre attacks in November of that year, a state of emergency was declared, and that has been extended ever since. President François Hollande says it will stay in force at least through May's presidential election. But France isn't alone. Amnesty says European countries are, quote, drawing inspiration from each other's regressive counter-terrorism measures. Hungary now gives its president the power to ban meetings, restrict movement and freeze assets in the event of a declared emergency. In October, Germany passed a new law giving police the right to monitor non-EU citizens communicating with someone in Germany. The UN says that law unfairly targets foreigners. Amnesty says Poland's new counter-terrorism law gives the government powers it would normally only have during a state of emergency, especially regarding surveillance of foreigners. And the report says that's a trend across Europe. Temporary emergency measures increasingly becoming embedded in ordinary law. Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have in London, John Dalhousen, Amnesty International's Director for Europe. In Brussels, Ricardo Dugolin, a senior analyst who heads the Europe desk at Drum Cusack, a political risk consultancy. And also in London, David Anderson, QC, the UK's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. Let's start, if we could, with John in London. Now, your report talks about Europe's approach to cherished values shifting fundamentally. Europe, of course, it's got quite a history of facing security challenges, not just of the type that we're looking at today, going back to the days of violent attacks by the IRA, of ETA in Spain, the mafia in Italy. I guess that my question is, how unprecedented and really permanent is this? Or is this just perhaps part of what you might call a normal cycle?
Well, I mean, certainly what we're seeing, if you look across the European Union, the breadth and depth of measures that are progressively eroding rights, hard fought for rights, is very significant. It's taken a long time to build these up. They're being taken away progressively, and the challenges we're seeing are significant. Is this a new long-standing development? It's hard to say that this is really entirely new, but certainly the breadth of them is alarming.
The breadth is alarming. David, also in London, that sort of characterization conflicts a little bit with your latest findings of the state, at least, of anti-terror legislation in the UK, where you're quoted in your report as saying that, quote, the hostile narrative of power-hungry security services, laws constantly being ratcheted up to new levels of oppression is quite simply false. Do you have a different take on what's happening in Europe?
Well, my job for the last 6 years has been to review what's happening in the UK. Yeah, I'm very glad that Amnesty, like me, is holding governments to account, including the United Kingdom government. And there are some things about counter-terrorism law and policy in the UK that I don't like. But there is another side to this which is not reflected in the Amnesty report. The laws that I review now in the UK are, on any view, less intrusive and less strong than they were 6 years ago. When I talked, for example, to Muslim groups 6 years ago, they were concerned about no suspicion, stop and search on the street. Well, that power has been repealed. It's not there anymore. They were concerned about being stopped and questioned at ports and airports as they entered the country or left the country, well, that power is still there, but its use is actually down by 70%. So I think to give a balanced picture, you have to give credit for the things that governments do well as quite rightly condemning them for things that they get wrong.
That's a really interesting picture there. Let me take the point back to John in London before we go to Ricardo, because one of the things that this Amnesty International report pointed out was sort of that the UK is somehow leading the way in the race to the bottom of repressive laws and security environments. That conflicts with the sort of picture that we're hearing from David of the situation becoming less intrusive. How do you explain that, John?
I think if you look across the range of measures that are being adopted across Europe, it's difficult to point out in any single one who's leading and who's leading overall. Certainly in respect of many of the measures, perhaps France is using the most disproportionate measures most consistently. I think the real issue here is the trend that we're seeing, whether it's measures that restrict the freedom of expression, the increasing use of apology for terrorism legislation, whether it's the extent of mass surveillance laws restricting the right to privacy, whether it's administrative control orders restricting the freedom of movement, undermining the presumption of innocence, being used a lot in France, but debate coming up in Holland and Germany about introducing them there. Really, I mean, it's looking across the breadth of countries introducing measures like this, targeting a whole range of rights under this impulse ever towards more security at the expense of more rights. And really there comes a time, and really what we're trying to do with this report is issue a warning to European societies to take a step back and think about the kind of societies they want to live in.
All right, before we go any further, let me bring Ricardo into this. Give us the perspective from the cold facts, if I could call them that. What does the research say? Does giving security services more powers equal improved security? Is the equation that simple, Ricardo?
I think that the equation is not that simple, because European countries, EU member states, are facing an unprecedented level of terrorist threat. And the Amnesty International report is raising some very interesting questions. But the issue at stake is not necessarily the level of the security involvement, but how security services are used by governments. And what we are seeing now is that the response is rather reactive to the threat, reactive to the developments, reactive to the attacks. And there should be, within the next months and in the medium term, a discussion on how to have a more proactive response to the terrorist threat, because we have mentioned the risk that Europe was seeing in the 70s and 80s in the UK, in Italy, in Spain. But the terrorist threat changed a lot since then. It's more transnational, it's linked to a global ideology, it's linked to global movements with a mass of people moving that is wider than it has ever been. Information is widely available, so the way that security agencies should be moving toward is of a more proactive measures rather than these state of emergencies and laws.
All right, Ricardo, if I could jump in,
catch up.
If we talk about proactive measures, what are we talking about specifically? I mean, do you have any sort of research that you could share with us to how in the current situation, you know, extended detention, stop and search powers actually work or don't work?
Well, it's interesting the points that you raise. So one of the main things that should be changed in modern days Europe is the way that we gather intelligence. Intelligence is a key factor in counter-terrorist measures, and so far governments are heavily reliant on signal intelligence, so everything that is monitoring and mass surveillance, which can lead to the issues raised by Amnesty International. In that sense, we should get back to more of an aspect of human intelligence, so the infiltration of networks that are suspects, infiltration of groups, and in that sense, combine human and signal intelligence to have more of a targeted monitoring of those groups. Issues that are linked to stop and search, these are more of a last-minute kind of approach to counter-terrorism, because we need to have an in-depth look at the networks that are operating within Europe, rather than trying to harden the targets, harden soft targets in European cities, deploy more police officers. This is something that we have seen in the latest 18 months that is not able to fully mitigate the risk of terrorism in Western Europe.
Okay, interesting. Leading off onto that, David, can one argue against some of the findings by this Amnesty report that says, for example, a Syrian national jailed 10 years in Hungary for quote-unquote an act of terror, which turns out to be he threw stones and used a megaphone at a demonstration, or French authorities putting environmental activists under house arrest during the 2015 UN climate conference under their emergency or anti-terror laws. Can you really say that these laws and courts are not increasingly defining terrorism too vaguely or too broadly?
Well, I'm certainly not going to defend either of those things, and I would agree, and in fact have said, that the definition of terrorism is too broad. But Ricardo is absolutely right that we need a proactive response. And he's right also in identifying that means good intelligence. Where I might differ perhaps from Ricardo is in saying, of course, human intelligence is important, but these days it's not the whole answer. The whole of life is going online, crime is going online as well, and law enforcement needs to follow it if it's going to be effective. So, for example, if you want to be proactive about the cyber warfare threat that we're experiencing from the Russian government, from the Chinese government, what you need to do is to be able to look in bulk at people's communications, not of course at what they're saying, but at the patterns of communications, and use that information in order to try to identify the source of malware or where the hacking is coming from. Now, you can call that mass surveillance if you like. I think that's a misleading term because no one is actually under surveillance in any very meaningful way, but it is the use of data in bulk in order to detect crime, and not just terrorist crime, but paedophilia, serious crime of other kinds as well. I think we need a much more nuanced debate about signals intelligence, digital intelligence. We already allow Google and Amazon access to huge quantities of our data. And when the security services are asking for limited access with strong safeguards for the purpose of keeping us safe and avoiding the need for some of the more onerous measures that you've mentioned under states of emergency, I think it's something that at least has to be debated.
All right, John wants to get in here.
I think the issue of the safeguard is very crucial there. And states have very differing practices in relation to increasingly sweeping surveillance measures. They don't have, that are not targeted, don't have sufficient judicial oversight, or very weak other forms of oversight, often that can't overrule the decision of a minister authorizing this kind of surveillance methodologies. So I think when we're talking about surveillance measures, we do need to keep in mind that when we're essentially sacrificing to a very significant extent a right to privacy, that needs to be surrounded by guarantees that that information will be used appropriately and in a targeted manner.
All right, let me take that point back to David. Are we missing, isn't that the point really of this whole discussion? Is there sufficient oversight and safeguards, or are security agencies getting more and more of a carte blanche or blank check to do what they want?
I agree with John that safeguards are the key. So I was disappointed when I read the Amnesty report to see that the brand new act which has been passed in the United Kingdom is described entirely in negative terms. Now, not everything in that act I would agree with. I think we could make the safeguards even stronger than they are. But what Parliament has achieved after more than a year of debate is first of all laying out frankly on the table all the powers that were previously used and continue to be used in many other Western countries, often without being acknowledged in law. And it would have been nice to see some recognition of that from Amnesty. And secondly, the strengthening of the safeguards. So, for example, if anyone wants to look at the content of anything you've actually written or said, then they must now have that approved by a senior judge.
All right, I'll give a brief chance to John to come back in on that. Overly critical?
Well, at the same time, I mean, the new Investigatory Powers Act does reproduce many of the provisions of the previous legislation that just towards the end of the last year, the European Court in Luxembourg considered to violate a number of key cornerstone rights in EU law. So there are definitely still problems with it. There's definitely still a broad application of mass surveillance powers that are not based on individual suspicion, with still very weak oversight. So, I mean, it may be in the case that in the UK, the institutional architecture, the practices that have evolved over time are somewhat more robust in their practices. But it remains the case that this is an incredibly broad power with relatively weak oversight.
All right, since we're on actually the issue of mass surveillance, let's bring Ricardo back into this. What does the research, if there is research into this, and this is a very secretive area, say about mass surveillance, at least from what we know? Is it effective in preventing attacks?
Well, in recent months, we have seen that several attacks, including at least one major one here in Brussels, were foiled thanks to the interception of messages that were sent either via telephones or via the internet. So to some extent, surveillance is saving lives. So that's a matter of fact. In France and in Belgium, this has worked to some extent. However, the point here as well is to be able for governments to optimize the use of manpower. So the usage of mass surveillance, if you may call it like this, needs a large amount of people able to analyze information, because we can gather a lot of information, a lot of intelligence, but to analyze it, it requires a large amount of intelligence officers, and this is something that governments need to be able to optimize, either by increasing the manpower that is used to analyze the intelligence received, or by having more targeted searches on specific threat groups, on specific threat networks, or on more specific issues.
Ricardo, let me jump in and ask you a question. Could that sort of information not have been gathered without the use of mass surveillance, or with any sort of regime that tightens up mass surveillance? Is it a black and white affair?
In that case, it's never a black and white affair. What we see here in Belgium, for example, what I was referring to, it was two people who were connected on a second degree to someone who was directly under investigation. So those persons were not directly under investigation, but they were exchanging messages concerning a potential attack here in the capital of Belgium. So the point here is that having a broader approach to signal intelligence is definitely something that enables police and intelligence forces to have more intelligence on potential terrorist plots. All of this intelligence obviously is not actionable, because a lot of that is only chatter among potential militants. But in the last 6 to 12 months, it did manage to foil some attacks.
All right, I do want to give David a chance, but before that, I want to take some of those points because they're interesting, and I want to take them back to John and say, what do you make of that argument one hears that, you know, mass surveillance sometimes saves lives. If you haven't got anything to worry about, don't worry about it.
There are lots of questions that arise. I mean, obviously, at a meta level, the more security measures that you put in place, the wider you place these measures, the more rights you restrict. A priori, the logic of that is that you can save more lives. I don't doubt that security forces have been able to save a number of lives with some of these increased powers. At the same time, the question arises, well, what, even with judicial controls, with greater levels of scrutiny, whether you'd still be able to have access to the same information while safeguarding people's rights. The question is, how much information about yourself are you prepared to give up to a government? You may trust a current one, but you're putting in place a mechanism of surveillance that can fall into the hands of any government with any inclination in the future. Europe is in a fairly febrile political state right now. And I think it's worth European populations standing up, reflecting for a moment on the powers that they are prepared to provide in relatively unscrutinized forms to their authorities.
David, one point that comes through on this report is that if you take if we talk about these measures individually, that's one thing, but when you put them all together, mass surveillance, when you talk about special powers going increasingly to governments, administrative orders, for example, which we're told they're supposed to be temporary, but they're becoming embedded in UK and French law, sometimes difficult to challenge because charges aren't brought, assumptions can be made about a person on the flimsiest of grounds of something they've said on their Facebook or Twitter page. They might be put on a list. Evidence is kept secret. When you put all that together, isn't then the overall picture a bit worrying?
I think these measures are to some extent alternatives for one another. And I think what policymakers and the public has to do is decide which type of measures they really think are necessary to keep us safe. Because if you take, for example, supposing a ship's landing at one of our ports. Now, if you know in advance who's on that ship, because you've got a good record of all the passengers, then you're in a position to do any checks, see if anyone's on a criminal terrorist database, anyone you might need to speak to, and everybody else can simply be allowed to go. If you don't know who's on that ship because you don't have the intelligence in advance, then that's when you might have to start questioning people at random or patting them down or searching them or whatever, which is intrusive in a different way. And I think anyone who's looking at these powers really needs to look at practically what they mean. The trouble with words like mass surveillance is they don't actually reflect what happens. And just to give you an example, and I wrote a study on the use of bulk powers this August. It's on my website if any of your viewers want to find it. But an example would be, supposing someone is arrested for a terrorist attack. Now, you don't know, are they a lone operator or are they part of a wider network? Well, the first thing you'd want to do is go to their telephone provider and say, could we have a list of the phone numbers this person's been speaking to over the last 6 months? Now, probably he may have been a little quiet in the days before the attack, but if you go back a month or two, you may well find that far from acting alone, they were taking instructions from somebody in Syria, or they were in league with somebody in another European city. And that is the sort of way that you thwart terrorist networks. And you can only do that, I'm afraid, by keeping that very basic data, call logs, which telephone companies compile anyway for their own commercial purposes, on everybody, including people who are not themselves under suspicion. Now, you could say that intrudes into their privacy. At one level, I would accept that that's the case. But so long as that information can only be accessed by people who are properly warranted after satisfaction of all the necessary safeguards, it seems to me it's a very important thing to have these powers to keep us safe. And to dismiss them as mass surveillance and say that they're misguided, I think, I'm afraid, is to
David,
put us all in more danger than we need to be in.
How do we know, the point that you made there, as long as they're being accessed by the right people, how do we know that, though?
Well, there are two things. You need independent authorization in advance by people who have nothing to do with the operation that is in progress, so that you don't get, for example, as they've seen in the USA, they've seen operatives accessing their girlfriends' communications to see who they've been speaking to, that kind of thing. I mean, you've got to stop that. But you also need review after the event, and you need heavy criminal penalties. And another thing that this new act in the UK does is introduce big criminal penalties for people who misuse other people's data.
Well, let me briefly take that point back to John. Review after the event, criminal penalties. Does that fix the problem?
The bottom line is people don't necessarily know, as you pointed out, that they are under surveillance at all. I mean, Amnesty International itself has been surveilled by the British government, and we only discovered this essentially by accident, and still are unaware of precisely what communications were being looked at. So what no one knows can necessarily never be challenged. And so, I mean, as David was saying, the independence of the review is crucial. That independence shouldn't be sought within the confines of the same security structure, but should be judicial. It should be genuinely independent and genuinely have authority. And that's just not the case in the vast majority of surveillance legislation we're seeing across Europe.
All right, and on that point, perhaps we go to Ricardo. Are new laws and measures disproportionately targeting minorities? How do you see it when you research the reality of attacks and the source of where attacks in Europe are coming from?
I think the point of disproportionate targeting may be part of the issue that I would like to raise here now, is that when we look at the security implications of the terrorist threats, we are moving toward a political discourse here, when we should have more of a technical and strategic discourse on how to implement these measures. And the talk we are having about surveillance highlights these points, highlights how institutional checks and technical issues should be at the forefront of the discussion.
All right.
In my research and in what we are seeing, Yeah.
Okay, I'm really sorry, but we are out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests very much for joining us. David in London, Ricardo in Brussels, and also John in London. And thank you too for watching. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.